Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a slow, strange walk through the weird, wobbly world of medieval food, where your daily bread might crawl away, your stew smells like wet socks, and dinner could kill you. No, seriously, the food sucked, and not just by modern standards. This was a time when chewing your lunch might also mean grinding up a beetle. Or two. You probably won't survive this, unless you're into lumpy porridge and fermented fish. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you all listen from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pick up the crust of bread sitting on the edge of a wooden table. It's hard, really hard, like you could defend a castle with it hard. Your teeth scrape the surface and you realize there's something moving. A tiny weevil waves at you. Congratulations. You're officially eating like a 14th century peasant. For most of medieval Europe, bread was life. And by life, I mean a slightly moldy, insect-inhabited brick that served as both meal and plate. You see, flour wasn't sifted or cleaned the way we do now. It was ground in open-air mills, often contaminated with insect eggs, bits of stone, and the occasional rat hair. Yum. And when the grain harvest was bad, bakers might bulk out their flour with anything from ground beans to, allegedly, powdered bones. Historians still argue whether such extreme fillers were common or urban legend, but food fraud was real and terrifyingly creative. Now let's talk cheese. Imagine unwrapping a lovely wedge of something creamy, only to find it wriggling. Medieval cheeses were often unpasteurized and aged in conditions we describe today as biohazard adjacent. Maggots and mold were normal features, not bugs to be removed, but sometimes part of the appeal. Casu marzu, the modern Sardinian maggot cheese, may be descended from similar medieval practices. And while you might grimace now, back then, it was a delicacy, possibly crunchy. And dairy? Let's just say if your milk wasn't already turning to curds by the time you got home, your cow was probably dead. There were no refrigerators, no pasteurization, and cows were rarely washed because why waste water? But wait, there's more. You'd think noble families fared better, right? Well, sort of. They had access to finer grains, richer cheeses, and imported goods, sure. But even their bread could be stale, their cheese moldy, and their kitchens plagued with vermin. Also, rats. So many rats. Quirky side note. Bread used to be used like a dish. Called a trencher, a thick slice of stale bread acted as a plate. After the meal, these soggy slabs could be eaten, if you were desperate, or tossed to beggars and dogs. That's right. You might be licking gravy off a week-old sourdough that's seen better centuries. Bon appetit. One particularly odd recipe from the 1300s suggests soaking stale bread in almond milk, grinding it with raisins, boiling it, and coloring it with saffron to simulate good food. Imagine trying to recreate cake using sadness, a twig, and expired tofu. That's basically what they were doing. Oh, and if you were sick, doctors might prescribe more bread, mixed with wine, or lard, sometimes even burned into charcoal and fed as powder. Historians still debate the actual effectiveness of these practices, though most agree the psychological benefit was probably the best part. Let's not forget storage. Bread would be baked in batches and stored for days, even weeks, depending on your wealth. By day 7, your loaf had the consistency of a sandstone sculpture and the taste of antique wood. You didn't toast it, you prayed over it. But food was food. People adapted. A bad loaf was better than no loaf, and many peasants ate the same meal day after day, week after week. In the biting cold of winter, even wormy cheese and stone-hard bread felt like a miracle. Hunger doesn't care about seasoning, and so you chew. Slowly. The texture is uneven. The crust is tougher than jerky. The inside, dense. You ignore the suspicious dark flecks and the faint scent of mold. It's a quiet moment, peasant's moment, and despite it all, you're grateful. You glance across the wooden table. A ceramic bowl of something awaits you next. It jiggles slightly, not a good sign, but that's a horror story for the next course. You eye the steaming bowl placed in front of you. The contents are uncertain. It smells vaguely like cabbage that gave up on life. There are bits of something floating in it, some meat probably. But it's soft. Too soft. Everything's been boiled into a flavorless mush. And yes, welcome to the second rule of medieval dining. If it's food, it's getting boiled. Boiling was the dominant cooking method across medieval Europe, especially for those without access to fancy kitchen tools or enough wood for baking. Ovens were a luxury. Firewood had to be collected, often taxed and carefully rationed. Boiling? Efficient, easy, and killed most of the bacteria, which, considering the hygiene standards, was a small culinary miracle. So they boiled everything. Vegetables, fruits, fish, even pastries. If it could be dunked into a pot and forgotten for 3 hours, it was dinner. The result? A texture profile somewhere between oatmeal and regret. Puddings, for instance, were not the sweet custards we know today. They were savory and gelatinous. Made from animal blood, suet, breadcrumbs, and herbs, all mushed together and boiled in cloth. You didn't slice a pudding, you slurped it. Slowly, carefully, while trying not to think too much. Historians still argue whether the excessive use of boiling was strictly practical or if it reflected a deeper belief in taming food through heat. Some scholars propose that boiling was associated with health, as it aligned with Galenic medical theory, making food humorally balanced for the stomach. Others say people were just trying to avoid dying from undercooked badger. Quirky fact time. There was a dish called hedgehog pudding, but it did not contain hedgehog. It was ground pork shaped to look like a hedgehog, pricked with almond slivers for spikes, and yes, it was boiled, because of course it was. Even meats weren't safe from this soggy fate. A medieval cook might boil beef, then reboil it with herbs, then serve it in a thickened sauce that had also been boiled. They didn't grill. Frying was rare and done mostly by the wealthy, since oil was expensive. So yes, even bacon was often boiled. And if you had something special, like a rabbit or pheasant, you didn't roast it to a nice golden crisp. No, you'd skin it, boil it, and maybe if you were lucky, someone would toss in a handful of bitter herbs. It wasn't about delight. It was about survival. Imagine your modern favorite dish, maybe it's pizza or a burger, and now imagine someone boiling it all together in one pot for 4 hours. That's the culinary vibe we're working with. Medieval food was more texture than taste, more sustenance than savor. And it wasn't just the peasantry. Even castle kitchens were bubbling away with giant cauldrons. Some records describe stews that were never fully emptied. Each day, new ingredients were added, and the pot just kept going. Like an eternal soup, a witch's cauldron, but with cabbage and disappointment. In fact, there are documented accounts of tavern stew pots that never cooled down, adding meat, grain, water, and vegetables as needed. This wasn't a recipe. It was a lifestyle. You didn't cook the stew. You joined its story. And because everything tasted pretty much the same, spices became status symbols, but more on that later. For now, imagine slurping another spoonful of turnip-carrot mystery goop while your cousin swears it's better than yesterday. Some cooks tried to get creative. They'd color their soups with saffron or beat in egg yolks for richness. But again, this was reserved for the upper classes. Most peasants were lucky to throw in an onion, when onions weren't believed to cause night sweats or invite demons. Strangely enough, boiling had its benefits. Boiled grains, like barley or millet, made for filling gruels. Broths retained nutrients. And in a time when the average peasant burned 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day working the land, you needed every soupy spoonful to count. Still, you can't help but wonder, did anyone look forward to dinner? Or was it just another task to survive? You stir the bowl. The contents have settled into layers. Some liquid on top, something gelatinous below, and a few unidentifiable clumps stuck to the sides. It's warm, at least, and filling, but your taste buds have mostly given up. There's something comforting, though, about the rhythm. Boiling doesn't require attention. You can leave the pot over a low fire and focus on weaving, or prayer, or watching your neighbor try to teach his goose how to sit. One fringe recipe calls for boiling eel, then stuffing it with boiled eggs, then covering the whole thing with more boiled eel. The logic, unknown. The taste, probably alarming. And as you scrape the last bit of stew from your bowl, you realize something. In the Middle Ages, eating wasn't about joy. It was about getting through the day. Your belly's full, kind of. You didn't die yet. That's a win. Time to rest before the next meal, which, spoiler alert, is going to involve salt. Lots and lots of salt. You wake up sore from the straw mattress, stretch your arms, and head toward the pantry, or what passes for one. There's no refrigerator humming, no pantry lights flicking on. Just a dark, musty corner with some sacks, maybe a wooden barrel, and the one thing you can always count on in medieval food: salt. Salt is everywhere. On your meat, in your fish, packed into your vegetables, clings to your tongue like sand. You've come to recognize its flavor not as seasoning, but as survival. Preserving food in the Middle Ages was a delicate dance with decay. No cold storage meant everything spoiled fast, unless you could salt it. Meat would be buried in salt and stored in barrels for weeks, sometimes months. The result? Something closer to jerky than roast. Hard, dry, and so salty it had to be soaked in water just to make it chewable. Soaked again. Boiled again. Then probably eaten with more salt. Because flavor. And you needed that meat. Protein wasn't abundant, and winters were harsh. For peasants, preserving pork from a slaughtered pig was vital. Every bit was saved. Even the fat was rendered into lard and stored in ceramic pots sealed with more. You guessed it, salt. There's an old joke among reenactors that medieval bacon was 30% pig, 70% sodium. They're not far off. Historians still argue whether people were truly used to such salty food or just didn't have a choice. Some medieval cookbooks suggest soaking meat for entire days in running water before cooking it. But for the poor, that luxury of time, water, or cleanliness was rarely an option. Quirky aside, some households reused brining liquid multiple times. That's right. After soaking one batch of salted fish, they dunk another into the same murky brine. Call it vintage flavor layering, or just gastrointestinal roulette. Salt also served political and economic roles. It was taxed heavily, often controlled by the crown or powerful guilds. In France, the hated gabelle salt tax even helped spark revolts. And in other parts of Europe, salt roads, paths dedicated to transporting this precious mineral, crisscrossed kingdoms. Your tongue's already tired from chewing last night's overboiled mutton. Now, facing a breakfast of preserved herring that smells like low tide and tastes like ocean tears, you begin to wonder, did medieval people ever enjoy food? Spoiler, probably not like we do. Food was functional. Fuel for the body, not a moment of pleasure. They didn't Instagram their breakfast. If anything, they were praying it wouldn't make them sick. Even wealthy households with better access to fresh meat often salted everything preemptively. Better safe than sorry when your butcher's shop sat next to a sewer and hygiene was, let's just say, imaginative. One monk famously wrote about preparing fish so pungent with salt that a devil would flee it. That wasn't praise. That was an exorcism. And then there's salted fish, especially cod and herring. These were staple exports in Northern Europe. Entire economies were built around catching, salting, and shipping these stiff, briny slabs. Pilgrims carried them. Monks stored them. Sailors gnawed on them like protein-flavored driftwood. A fringe belief held that eating too much salted meat could cause melancholy, or worse, corrupt the soul. Some clerics believed it led to spiritual dullness. Others just believed it made your breath smell like a medieval compost heap. But salt had its moments of glory, too. It was ceremonially important. Shared at feasts to represent hospitality. Placed on tables to signify social status. Those seated above the salt were the honored guests. Everyone else? Peasantville. So when you pick up your morning ration, maybe a slice of salt pork, maybe a hunk of dried fish, you're not just eating. You're engaging in centuries of survival tradition. And involuntarily preserving your organs from the inside out. You chew slowly. Your lips chap. Your tongue feels like it's been sunbathing. Your throat begs for water, which you might not have or might not trust. But there's no avoiding it. Salt is life. Salt is preservation. Salt is punishment. You set your wooden plate down. Somewhere in the distance, Someone sneezes. Hard to say if it's from a cold or just the salt fumes. And as you shuffle toward the next task of the day, you catch yourself wondering if there's ever a bite of food that doesn't taste like seawater filtered through a boot. Not today. You catch the scent before you see it. Something spicy, sharp, almost unfamiliar. Your nose perks up like a dog's. Could it be a hint of flavor? Real, glorious seasoning? You follow the trail into the manor kitchen, where a pot is bubbling and a servant is carefully grinding something dark and brittle with a mortar and pestle. Pepper. Actual black pepper. You feel like you've stumbled into a royal secret. And, in a way, you have. Because in medieval Europe, spices weren't just food enhancers. They were power moves, a display of wealth, of status, of very literal riches burned into your sauce. The sheer cost of spices in the Middle Ages is mind-blowing. Black pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves. These were so valuable, they were often locked away like jewelry. A pound of saffron could cost more than a horse. Pepper was sometimes accepted in lieu of coin. That's right, peppercorns as rent. Imagine paying your landlord in little black balls of fire. Spices came from far, very far, across deserts and oceans, traded through Byzantine ports, Arab merchants, and Venetian galleys. Historians still debate how much of this trade was controlled by monopolies versus open markets, but either way, it was the stuff of empires. You were more likely to see a unicorn in your backyard than a nutmeg in a peasant's soup. The wealthy, however, went wild with spices. So wild that most of their food didn't taste like food anymore. Meats drenched in spice mixes. Wines infused with cinnamon and clove. Entire dishes masked in saffron and ginger to the point where the original ingredient was unrecognizable. Some say it was to cover the taste of questionable meat. Others argue it was simply to show off. Quirky aside, there were spice vaults, actual rooms or chests with iron locks where noble households stored their precious powders. Servants caught stealing a few grains might face serious punishment, like ear removal. Yes, for pepper. Even the church got involved. Some clergy viewed spices with suspicion, calling them temptations of the flesh. Others saw them as God's fragrant gifts. Depends on the bishop and how much he liked mulled wine. But you're a lowly kitchen boy. The best spice you've tasted all year was a leaf that accidentally fell into the stew. So seeing someone openly grind pepper into a noble's meal feels like watching someone paint gold on a rock. And here's the twist. Sometimes, even the nobles weren't sure how to use their spices. Recipes were vague. Measurements were unclear. One chronicler describes a feast dish that used a generous amount of powder forte, which sounds like a flavor profile, but might as well be alchemy. The result? Dishes so heavily seasoned they tasted more like perfume than poultry. You inch closer to the table, where someone is laying out spiced wine in a pewter cup. The aroma is dizzying. Red wine warmed with sugar, cinnamon, maybe even a dash of ginger or cardamom. You're tempted, but that cup isn't for you. Historians still argue whether medieval spice usage was truly about taste or more about symbolism. Did people love the flavor? Or did it just mean they'd made it? Was spice the medieval equivalent of flexing a Lamborghini? Very possibly. Meanwhile, your supper tonight will involve exactly 0 exotic spices. Maybe a sprinkle of local herbs, parsley if you're lucky. More likely, wild garlic or nettles. Nothing traded over oceans. Nothing a merchant would kill for. But you remember once, years ago, when a traveling monk shared a chunk of bread rubbed with oil and a pinch of something he called long pepper. It stung your tongue, made your eyes water. You laughed and cried at the same time. It was glorious. That memory has stuck with you ever since. A flash of heat, a note of mystery. Proof that food could be more than mush. That meals could be memorable, even thrilling. Today, though, your stew still tastes like beige. You look at the noble's dish, powdered with saffron and trimmed with sliced dates. It's food meant for poetry. Yours is food meant for labor. But you close your eyes and imagine, just for a moment, that you're seated at that high table, that the pepper is yours, that every bite is rich, warm, and alive. Then someone throws you a crust and tells you to clean the trenchers. Dreams over. You sit down for what the village calls a meal, but it looks suspiciously like the one you had yesterday, and the day before that, and probably for the next 6 weeks. Is pottage. Again, pottage is less a recipe and more a concept. Boil whatever you have into a thick stew and pray for flavor. Beans, leeks, barley, onions if you're lucky. If you're not lucky, just water, and whatever the dog didn't notice you stole from the market pile. Pottage wasn't exclusive to the poor, but it was absolutely their most reliable food. Peasants practically lived on it. You could stretch it, reheat it, keep it simmering over the fire day and night. Some pottages weren't just cooked for hours, they were cooked for weeks, topped up with new ingredients each day. You weren't making a fresh dish. You were tending to a bubbling family heirloom. Historians still debate whether these never-ending stews were literal or simply figurative, but evidence suggests some pots truly stayed in service until the bottom crust blackened beyond repair. Today's pottage? Thick, brownish green. There's a mushy root vegetable in it, maybe turnip. The smell isn't unpleasant, just predictable. It fills your nose and your memory like an old cloak, comforting and itchy at the same time. Pottage had many faces, thickened with oats in winter, thinned with cabbage in spring, sometimes served cold like a sad gelatin, sometimes over bread, sometimes as bread depending on what grains you had and how much water you were trying to save. There were variants with peas, lentils, and wild herbs. One quirky recipe from a 14th century household suggests adding mashed apple to pottage, then cooking it with ale until it smells like morning fields. Sounds poetic. Probably tasted like hot compost. For protein, people might throw in a marrow bone or a pork rind. You could chew the gristle and imagine it was meat. Sometimes they'd stir in blood for extra iron. Yes, blood. It was economical, practical, and very, very red. And yet, despite its drabness, pottage was central to medieval life. It fed everyone, from kids to grandparents, twice a day if you were lucky. It simmered while you worked, burbled through holidays, and always tasted the same. Or at least close enough that no one remembered. One 15th century monk wrote that pottage brings peace to the belly, though not to the soul. He wasn't wrong. Kept you alive. But joy? That was optional. You dip a hunk of yesterday's crust into your bowl. It softens eventually. You chew. You swallow. You don't even notice anymore. Quirky fact. In wealthier homes, pottage was dressed to impress. Flavored with imported saffron, or poured over roasted birds for texture contrast. One bizarre dish combines sweet pottage with chopped dates, almonds, and rosewater. Historians still argue if it was delicious or a culinary crime. Meanwhile, your version is lumpy and beige and smells like boiled sock. Still, it's not the worst thing you've eaten. At least there's no visible mold. No worms today. A small win. And you can't deny its usefulness. A giant pot of pottage might feed a whole family, plus the neighbor's kids, and still stretch for breakfast tomorrow. You don't need utensils, just hands, maybe a shared spoon. No ceremony, no fuss. A typical day might go like this: work the fields, return at dusk, scoop pottage, sit, eat, sleep, repeat. No menus, no seasoning choices, just pottage. And in some strange way, you begin to appreciate it. It doesn't surprise you. It doesn't betray you. It's the food equivalent of an old, scratchy blanket. You wouldn't take it to a royal feast, but you'd miss it if it disappeared. As you scrape the bottom of the wooden bowl, you wonder what it would be like to taste something else. A roast, a pie, a lemon. But that's not for today. Today is for survival, and pottage, lumpy, lukewarm, and eternal, has your back. You lick the last smear from your fingers and lean back on your bench. The pot still simmers behind you, quietly gurgling like it's sharing an old joke you've heard 1,000 times. And tomorrow, more pottage. Always more pottage. You sit down for what the village calls a meal, but it looks suspiciously like the one you had yesterday, and the day before that, and probably for the next 6 weeks. Is pottage. Again, pottage is less a recipe and more a concept. Boil whatever you have into a thick stew and pray for flavor. Beans, leeks, barley, onions if you're lucky. If you're not lucky, just water, and whatever the dog didn't notice you stole from the market pile. Pottage wasn't exclusive to the poor, but it was absolutely their most reliable food. Peasants practically lived on it. You could stretch it, reheat it, keep it simmering over the fire day and night. Some pottages weren't just cooked for hours, they were cooked for weeks, topped up with new ingredients each day. You weren't making a fresh dish. You were tending to a bubbling family heirloom. Historians still debate whether these never-ending stews were literal or simply figurative, but evidence suggests some pots truly stayed in service until the bottom crust blackened beyond repair. Today's pottage? Thick, brownish green. There's a mushy root vegetable in it, maybe turnip. The smell isn't unpleasant, just predictable. It fills your nose and your memory like an old cloak, comforting and itchy at the same time. Pottage had many faces, thickened with oats in winter, thinned with cabbage in spring, sometimes served cold like a sad gelatin, sometimes over bread, sometimes as bread depending on what grains you had and how much water you were trying to save. There were variants with peas, lentils, and wild herbs. One quirky recipe from a 14th century household suggests adding mashed apple to pottage, then cooking it with ale until it smells like morning fields. Sounds poetic. Probably tasted like hot compost. For protein, people might throw in a marrow bone or a pork rind. You could chew the gristle and imagine it was meat. Sometimes they'd stir in blood for extra iron. Yes, blood. It was economical, practical, and very, very red. And yet, despite its drabness, pottage was central to medieval life. It fed everyone, from kids to grandparents, twice a day if you were lucky. It simmered while you worked, burbled through holidays, and always tasted the same. Or at least close enough that no one remembered. One 15th century monk wrote that pottage brings peace to the belly, though not to the soul. He wasn't wrong. Kept you alive. But joy? That was optional. You dip a hunk of yesterday's crust into your bowl. It softens eventually. You chew. You swallow. You don't even notice anymore. Quirky fact. In wealthier homes, pottage was dressed to impress. Flavored with imported saffron, or poured over roasted birds for texture contrast. One bizarre dish combines sweet pottage with chopped dates, almonds, and rosewater. Historians still argue if it was delicious or a culinary crime. Meanwhile, your version is lumpy and beige and smells like boiled sock. Still, it's not the worst thing you've eaten. At least there's no visible mold. No worms today. A small win. And you can't deny its usefulness. A giant pot of pottage might feed a whole family, plus the neighbor's kids, and still stretch for breakfast tomorrow. You don't need utensils, just hands, maybe a shared spoon. No ceremony, no fuss. A typical day might go like this: work the fields. Return at dusk. Scoop pottage. Sit. Eat. Sleep. Repeat. No menus. No seasoning choices. Just pottage. And in some strange way, you begin to appreciate it. It doesn't surprise you. It doesn't betray you. It's the food equivalent of an old, scratchy blanket. You wouldn't take it to a royal feast, but you'd miss it if it disappeared. As you scrape the bottom of the wooden bowl, you wonder what it would be like to taste something else. A roast, a pie, a lemon. But that's not for today. Today is for survival, and pottage, lumpy, lukewarm, and eternal, has your back. You lick the last smear from your fingers and lean back on your bench. The pot still simmers behind you, quietly gurgling like it's sharing an old joke you've heard 1,000 times. And tomorrow, more pottage. Always more pottage. You wake up to the church bells, and you already know it's Friday again. Which means one thing: no meat. Not even the leathery salted kind. Not even the gristle. Just fish. And if you're lucky, it won't still be blinking. Thanks to the church's influence, large swaths of the medieval calendar were meatless. Not just Fridays. There were entire seasons: Lent, Advent, Ember Days, Saints' Eves, when animal flesh was forbidden. Some years, nearly half the days were fasting days. But don't picture modern health cleanses. This wasn't optional, and it certainly wasn't healthy. You trudge to the cook fire, nose already bracing for what's coming. The smell of fish lingers like an unwanted guest. You half expect a herring to leap from the pot and file a complaint about overwork. The fish of the day? Probably dried cod or pickled herring. If you're inland, it's likely old, smoked, salty, maybe fried in oil if your manor has any left. More likely, it's boiled again, then served with leeks or onions to try and mask the taste. Try, not succeed. Historians still argue how strictly these fasting laws were followed in practice. Some noble households bent the rules. Others got crafty. Enter the loophole diet, the most famous trick: reclassifying animals. The church, for reasons both practical and possibly humorous, declared that aquatic animals didn't count as meat. So you get culinary oddities like otters, puffins, and beavers being served on Fridays. Yes, beavers. Because they swam, they were considered fish. Their tails were a particular delicacy. Apparently, they sizzled like bacon when roasted. Monks rejoiced. Quirky aside, there's a 15th century tale of monks in Ghent training their pet beaver to swim only during fast days. They argued it chose to be fish on Fridays. Creative theology at its finest. For the average villager, though, these nuances didn't matter. You ate what you had: salted eel, dried perch, insects that accidentally fell into the stew, technically not meat, probably extra protein. The worst part? You didn't even get cheese, or eggs, or milk. Those were banned too. Anything from animals that bleed was off the table. So what remained? Lentils, beans, barley, bread, and more fish. Always more fish. Even wealthy households had to obey, outwardly at least. Behind closed doors, historians suggest some nobles may have bribed clergy for dispensations. A generous donation, and suddenly your Sunday roast became ecclesiastically acceptable poultry. Still, kitchens across Europe scrambled to dress up fish in dozens of ways. Cookbooks include recipes for almond milk sauces, rose-scented fish custards, and even fish pies filled with raisins and ginger. Because nothing says holy restraint like a trout inside a pie inside your hypocrisy. Today, your neighbor managed to buy a single smoked haddock from a traveling fishmonger. The thing is ancient. The smell could stop a wolf. But it's food. You slice it thin, lay it on your bread trencher, and chew slowly, pretending it's something else. The bones crunch softly. The skin peels like old paint. You chase it down with weak ale and call it dinner. And while you eat, the church bells ring again. A reminder that your soul is being purified, even if your taste buds are under siege. Not all fast days were terrible, though. Sometimes the change from meat-heavy meals gave your stomach a break. Some monks even claimed they preferred the lighter fare: lentil soup, cabbage gruel, baked apples. But of course, they weren't tilling fields 12 hours a day. Their idea of fasting was different. You lean back, belly half full, mind drifting. The fire crackles. Someone's playing a tune on a reed pipe. A child tosses pebbles at a chicken. And somewhere, a bishop is dining on buttered sole and calling it penance. You shake your head, bite into the last sliver of fish, and try not to think about tomorrow because it's another fasting day. Again, you're back in the village bakery, helping sweep ash and stack kindling, when the Lord Steward arrives with a smug expression and a bag of pale white flour. The baker bows deeply. You, meanwhile, glance down at your own sack, dark, gritty, and full of mystery bits that may or may not once had legs. Today's lesson? Not all bread was created equal. In medieval Europe, bread wasn't just food. It was status. The whiter the bread, the wealthier the eater. Nobles dined on soft, snow-colored loaves called manchet, made from finely sifted wheat flour. Peasants, on the other hand, gnawed their way through coarse rye, barley, or oat bread. Dense, dark, and sometimes dangerous. You toss a few logs into the oven and remember last week's village rumor. A family in the next hamlet ate moldy rye bread and started seeing demons. Not metaphorically, actual hallucinations. Faces in trees. Snakes in the sky. One man tried to baptize a cow. Ergot poisoning, caused by a fungus that thrives in damp rye. It mimics LSD, but with more vomiting. Historians still argue whether whole outbreaks of possession or madness during the Middle Ages were actually mass ergotism. Imagine your bread turning into a bad trip. and you can't stop eating it because it's all you have. Quirky aside, some records show attempts to counteract moldy flour with beer or wine, soaking the bread to revive it. The result was a slurry locals nicknamed poor man's porridge. Better than starvation, slightly worse than sadness. You help the baker pull a fresh batch from the oven. The noble's manchet glows golden. It smells like luxury, lightly yeasty, buttery even. Your own loaf is darker, dense, thuds when dropped. Probably needs a chisel to slice. Still, bread was a cornerstone of every meal. Breakfast, bread and ale. Lunch, bread and cheese, maybe onions. Dinner, bread dipped in pottage. There were no baguettes, no sourdough bowls, no artisan loaves with sprigs of rosemary. Just survival squares, and sometimes actual rocks inside. That's not hyperbole. Stone fragments from grindstones often ended up in flour. Chewing could wear down your teeth, literally. Archaeologists have found medieval skeletons with enamel filed flat from years of biting through grit bread. Nothing like a side of dental erosion with your turnip soup. And yet, people found ways to make do. Some mixed in chestnut flour or ground legumes to bulk out dough. Others added herbs or boiled root vegetables. These weren't flavor experiments, they were extensions, stretching a meal for one into a meal for four. In cities, bread was regulated. Bakers had to follow weight and size standards, often enforced by local guilds. Bake a loaf too light? You could be pilloried in the town square or worse, banned from baking altogether. One infamous case in London involved a baker who shorted his loaves. The punishment? He had to parade through the streets with substandard bread chained around his neck. Public shaming by carbohydrates. And so, today you take your own loaf and slice it thin. Crumbles. It's dry. But it fills the gaps in your stomach. You chew carefully, avoiding the harder bits. You don't hallucinate, so that's a win. You watch the noble's loaf get slathered in fresh butter, imported, probably. Maybe even a bit of honey. You imagine the softness, the way it melts on the tongue. You imagine not having to swallow twice just to make it go down. And yet, you don't resent your bread. Not really. It's dependable. Honest. A little moldy, yes, but yours. Later, as you lie on your straw mat, you dream of warm loaves, golden crusts, soft crumbs. In your dream, the bread smiles at you. You try to eat it. It runs away. Even your dreams are hungry. You wake up thirsty. Not the I need a sip kind, but the I would trade my boots for a drop of anything clean kind. You stumble out of your cottage, glance toward the well, then think better of it. The water's cloudy. Again. In the Middle Ages, drinking water was a gamble. Wells could be shallow, contaminated, or shared with livestock. Streams? Full of runoff, waste, and occasional mysterious floating things. So what did people do? They drank beer. Not the frothy, craft kind with notes of apricot and smugness. No, this was small beer. Barely fermented, barely alcoholic, and barely palatable. But it was safe. Boiled during brewing, it killed off most waterborne pathogens. You could drink it without worrying your intestines would mutiny. Even children drank beer. It wasn't about the buzz, it was about not dying of dysentery. A typical peasant might down several pints a day, even at breakfast. You sip from a wooden mug now. It's warm, flat, slightly sour. But hey, no worms. Win. Historians still debate just how alcoholic this beer was. Some argue small beer had less than 1% alcohol. Barely enough to cloud your thoughts. Others think it varied widely depending on region, brewer skill, and yeast type. What's clear is that it was constant. Quirky fact? Monks often brewed the best beer. Some even designed multi-tiered batches. Strong ale for the abbot, medium for guests, and weak small beer for workers. Holiness aside, those guys knew how to hydrate. You take another sip. The bitterness clings to the sides of your mouth. Better than pond water. Probably. Wine was a luxury. In the north, it was expensive and imported. In the south, more common, but still not your average peasant's drink. Most of what you got was sour, watered down, and stored in questionable barrels. Vinegar in progress. Milk? Only if you had a cow. And if your cow wasn't currently dry, sick, or wandering the neighbor's yard. And even then, it soured fast. You could curdle it into cheese or churn it into butter, but straight drinking? Risky. So you drank beer. All day. Every day. Which explains why some medieval letters complain about sluggish mornings and drowsy afternoons. Imagine an entire workforce with the mild buzz of breakfast ale. You sit outside, eating your stale bread and sipping your beer. The sun's barely up. The chickens are bickering. A dog sniffs your foot. And you think, not for the first time, that you'd kill for something cold. No ice. No cooling system. Even water from the well warms by midday. On a summer afternoon, people would drink tepid ale and fan themselves with bundles of straw. If someone in your village had a wine cellar, it was a marvel. A cool place for cheese, meat, and your dreams. You remember hearing about snow being packed in cellars in the far Alps, kept under layers of hay. But that's fairy tale stuff. Here, the only ice you see is in winter, and it comes with frostbite and ruined boots. You glance toward the manor again. Rumor has it they have imported wines, bottled in green glass, poured into silver goblets. You've seen the Lord hold his cup like a scepter, sipping something red and rich. You imagine the taste. You imagine not having to strain bits of barley from your drink. But you're no noble. Your mug is clay, your beer is flat, and your hydration plan is simple. Drink until you're not dizzy. Still, there's comfort in routine. You know the rhythm of this drink, the softness of its bitterness, the dull warmth it spreads through your chest. And when you finish, you rinse the mug in a trickle of water from the roof's edge, give it a wipe with your sleeve and set it by the door. You won't be winning any sommelier awards, but you'll stay alive. Mostly. You're standing in the market square now, watching a baker get loudly scolded by a town official. The poor man holds up his hands in protest, but it's too late. His bread is weighed, found too light, and seized for public shame. His punishment? Fine, maybe a night in the stocks. All because his loaf was a few ounces short. Welcome to the delightful world of medieval food laws. In a society where food scarcity could turn deadly overnight, rules around who sold what and how were surprisingly strict. Guilds controlled trades like baking, brewing, butchery, and cheesemaking with an iron ladle. If you wanted to sell food, you had to follow the rules. Or else. The most famous of these was the assize of bread and ale, a medieval English law that fixed the price, weight, and ingredients of bread and beer. You couldn't just decide to make a smaller loaf and charge the same price. Nope. You had to weigh it, measure it, and sell it according to grain prices set by the crown. If grain was scarce, your loaf got smaller, but your price couldn't go up. Bakers were expected to take the hit. If they didn't, pillory time, public shaming, sometimes even jail. Historians still debate how fairly these laws were enforced. But one thing's clear. You did not mess with bread. Quirky aside, to avoid penalties, some bakers gave an extra roll or small loaf with every dozen sold. This became known as the baker's dozen. 13 instead of 12. Not generosity, just self-protection from angry customers with pitchforks. But laws didn't just apply to bakers. Butchers were watched too. Selling old meat, cutting corners on weight, you might find your carcass confiscated and your shop banned. Fishmongers, cheesemakers, even pie vendors all lived under the same hovering threat of inspection and punishment. Today, the town crier shouts about a fish seller caught soaking old trout in vinegar to fake freshness. The villagers boo. The seller swears the fish was only slightly dead. It doesn't help. In big cities, food inspectors, sometimes called ale conners or bread weighers, would wander the streets, poking barrels, weighing flour sacks, and tasting beer. Yes, some men were paid to drink beer for justice. That's a job title. Of course, not everyone followed the rules. Fraud was everywhere. Sawdust in sausages, chalk in flour, dirty water in ale. One particularly creative butcher in France was caught mixing horse meat with beef and hiding the smell using cloves. You have to respect the audacity, until you remember you probably ate his sausage last week. You pass a stall selling pies. They look good. Too good. You squint at the crust. Is it flaky because of butter or bugs? You decide not to ask. Food adulteration was such a problem that city councils sometimes posted banned ingredient lists on tavern walls. No ground bones. No spoiled lard. No coloring old meat with ash to make it look fresh. And definitely no selling rat as rabbit. Again, even with all this oversight, punishments could be inconsistent. If you were rich, you paid a fine and carried on. If you were poor, you got the stocks or worse. A London baker in the 1300s was caught diluting flour with clay and had to parade through town with a loaf tied to his head. Yes, public hat-shaming. And yet, despite all these rules, people still lined up at market stalls, hoping for something edible, something cheap, something that didn't crawl or smell like feet. You do the same. You finally buy a slice of coarse rye, a wedge of questionable cheese, and a boiled egg with a suspicious crack. The vendor swears it's fresh. You nod and pay, knowing full well she might be lying. But you're hungry, and the egg's still warm. That's usually a good sign. You walk home, watching the baker clean up his seized loaves under the eye of the law. He glances at you and shrugs, as if to say, "At least it's not mold this time." You bite into your bread. It's heavy, a little sour, but no bugs. A victory, for now. You sit on a splintery bench at the back of the cookhouse, staring at a bowl of greens. Not salad, don't even think that word. This is more like a bitter pile of regret someone pulled from the garden and dumped straight into your lap. Because here's the thing. Medieval people didn't trust raw vegetables. Not in the "that's boring" way. In the "that might literally make you sick, unholy, or dead" way. The logic. Cooking purified. Heat balanced your bodily humors. Raw food was cold, wet, disorderly, and therefore, suspicious. You poke the leaves with a wooden spoon. They look wilted, but that's intentional. The cook has prepared them, meaning they've been boiled, fried in oil, or stewed with leeks until all crunch and color is gone. Medieval cuisine loved its vegetables soggy, limp, and compliant. Historians still argue about the extent of raw veg avoidance. Some suggest it was total. Others note exceptions in certain regions. But what's clear is that if you walked into a peasant home munching a raw turnip like an apple, you might get an exorcism. Quirky aside, some believed cucumbers could cause madness. Lettuce might induce melancholy if eaten at the wrong hour. And don't even look at raw onions unless you were planning to ward off demons or scare off your spouse. The great medieval medical minds, like Hildegard of Bingen and the ever-popular Galen, believed food affected your internal humors. Raw foods were deemed cold and moist, throwing your balance into chaos. Cooking, by contrast, made things warm and dry, much better for avoiding leprosy, melancholia, or spontaneous combustion. Probably, even fruits weren't safe. Apples were baked, pears stewed, grapes dried into raisins or mashed into wine. Eating them fresh, straight from the tree? Tisk. Irresponsible. Unless it was high summer and you had a doctor's note. You take a tentative bite of your greens. They've been boiled in broth until they resemble seaweed. There's a vague earthy flavor, a little salt, and not much else. But no cramps, no visions, no purging. So that's a win. Salads did exist in the Middle Ages, just not the crisp, garden-fresh kind. A salad might include chopped herbs, cold-cooked vegetables, and a drizzle of oil or vinegar. But the idea of raw, leafy greens as a daily staple? That was for rabbits, and possibly heretics. Meanwhile, your noble lord, up in his high hall, might nibble something a bit fresher. Wealth meant better access to oils, spices, and safe greens. But even then, they'd be blanched, tossed with rosewater, or served in moderation. One cookbook warns not to eat too many raw herbs lest they chill the liver and bloat the belly. No one wants a chilly liver. You remember your aunt once tried to grow spinach and got scolded by the village herbalist for inviting bile into the household. She boiled it for 3 hours. It was gray, memorable if not enjoyable. So today's meal is a compromise. Stewed greens, a few bits of boiled leek, and a slice of bread. You eat it slowly, imagining a world where a tomato isn't considered poison and a cucumber is just a cucumber. Speaking of which, tomatoes, potatoes, and corn? None of them existed in Europe yet. They were still hanging out in the new world, minding their own business. So your veggie options are limited. Roots, leaves, maybe a few beans if the season's right. And all of them, of course, cooked into submission. You finish your bowl, lick your fingers, and feel fine. A little gassy, maybe, but no fever, no demonic visions. So far, so good. You glance out at the garden patch where someone's pulling up cabbages. They're probably going straight into a pot with barley and onions. And you'll eat it, like always, because in the Middle Ages, food wasn't supposed to be fresh. It was supposed to be safe. Whether it tasted good, that was secondary. You arrive at the midday meal, and instead of a bowl or even a trencher, you're handed nothing. Just a spot at the table and a hopeful look toward the center. Which is fair, because what's in the middle isn't much. A few torn loaves, a crusty pot of beans, and one very greasy duck leg that everyone's politely ignoring. It's time to eat. With your hands. That's right, no forks, no personal plates, no napkins. In the medieval world, table manners were a very different experience. Eating wasn't an individual activity. It was communal. Food was shared, touched, passed, and grabbed, often with little concern for personal hygiene. You'd sit at a long table, often with strangers, and dig in using fingers, knives, and spoons if you had one. The same loaf of bread might be passed around 10 people. One trencher, remember the slab of stale bread used as a plate, might be shared by 2. And yes, that same bread would be eaten at the end, soaked in grease and soup residue, or given to beggars. Or dogs. Or chickens. Or you. Yum. You reach forward and tear a chunk from the loaf, being careful not to touch too much else. The person next to you wipes their nose on their sleeve, then immediately reaches for the beans. You sigh. It's going to be one of those meals. Historians still debate how much attention people paid to hygiene during meals. Some etiquette guides from the time suggest washing hands before eating. But with what? Soap was rare, and clean water wasn't always an option. So, while lords and ladies might have servants bring warm bowls of rose-scented water to rinse, the average villager wiped their hands on the tablecloth, if there was one. Quirky aside, medieval salt wasn't just for seasoning. It was social currency. A communal salt bowl would be placed on the table, and where you sat in relation to it determined your status. Above the salt meant honor. Below the salt? Let's just say your opinion didn't matter much. You pass the salt to someone with 3 fingers covered in duck grease. They nod. You nod. No one speaks. There's a certain silent agreement. We're doing our best. Cutlery was scarce. Most people had their own eating knife, a short personal blade used to cut meat, spear cheese, or scrape stew. You were expected to bring it with you like a modern-day reusable fork. No knife? You tore and dipped. Forks didn't appear in most of Europe until much later. In fact, when they first showed up, some clergy hated them. They claimed using a fork was an affront to God's design. After all, he gave you fingers. Why insult him with a pronged stick? One Italian princess in the 11th century was mocked for using a golden fork at her wedding banquet. 2 years later, she died of plague. Coincidence? The clergy didn't think so. And so, you eat with your fingers. Carefully. Strategically. You avoid touching your face. You try not to notice what's under someone's nails. You focus on your bread, your beans, your possibly a vegetable but maybe just dirt clump. You remember once being invited to a wedding where everyone shared a giant pie. Not slices, just hands. By the end, the crust was gone. The filling was everywhere. And someone's uncle had gravy on his elbow. A good time was had by all. Possibly. You chew your way through the rest of the meal. The grease clings to your fingertips. You wipe them on your tunic. Someone burps. Someone else sneezes directly onto the table. No one reacts. You glance down at your fingers. They're shiny, sticky, alive. A dog appears under the table and starts licking your hand. You let him. Honestly, he's cleaner than some of the people here. When the meal ends, everyone stands. The trenchers are scraped into buckets. The bowls are rinsed barely. The pot of beans goes back on the fire, waiting for its next resurrection. You lick a final bit of grease from your thumb and wonder how your ancestors made it through the day without wet wipes. Then again, maybe they didn't. The sun is barely rising when your stomach growls. Again, you curl under your rough wool blanket, trying to ignore the hollow ache. But there's no escaping it, not today, not this month. It's the hungry gap. This bleak stretch between the last of winter stores and the first spring harvest was dreaded across medieval Europe. And it hit hard. Grain bins ran low. Root vegetables withered. The cabbage had long since gone sour. There was no food coming in, only the memory of meals already eaten. You drag yourself up and cross the yard. A few chickens scratch at frozen dirt. The garden is bare. Not even weeds are growing. This is what scarcity feels like, not famine exactly. Just nothing. Historians still debate how widespread the hungry gap truly was. Some suggest it was a near-universal phenomenon. Others think it varied by region, depending on preservation techniques and climate. But for most medieval villages, March to early May was the tightrope walk between survival and starvation. Quirky aside, some communities celebrated spring festivals not because they were flush with food, but because they weren't dead yet. That's a mood. You find your neighbor, Gertrude, boiling a pot of something suspicious. She lifts the lid. It's nettle soup. Again, sharp, bitter, and vaguely medicinal. It stings the tongue a little, but it's warm. And right now, that's a luxury. She offers you a wooden cup. You sip slowly. Tastes like boiled lawn. You nod your thanks. Even for wealthier households, the hungry gap wasn't pleasant. Their larders were larger, sure, but fresh food was scarce. No green vegetables. No eggs, the hens weren't laying. No milk, the cows hadn't calved yet. Even meat was hard to come by unless you'd salted extra. So they, too, turned to pickles, dried fruit, and groats. You remember once watching a noble lady eat boiled quince from a glass jar while pretending to enjoy it. Her face said otherwise. For peasants, this was the time of creative cuisine. You mixed barley with the last crumbs of cheese. You scraped fat from stored bacon and smeared it on dry bread. You soaked stale loaves in thin broth to create a mush that didn't crack your teeth. And when even that ran out, you foraged. Nettles, sorrel, dandelion leaves, wild garlic. Whatever the goats hadn't found first. One family you know once made stew out of tree bark and moss. You don't ask how it tasted. They survived. Barely. Children suffered the most. Thin limbs, pale faces, bellies bloated from malnutrition. You try not to look too long when they beg for extra scraps. You don't have them. You remember that last onion in the cupboard. You saw it this morning, softening, sprouting, halfway to compost. And yet you'll eat it tonight. Slice it into broth. Pretend it's enough. Quirky fact, medieval cookbooks, especially the fancier ones, are largely silent on the hungry gap. They talk about feasts, about venison with cinnamon. They don't mention boiled turnip leaves or bread milk, made from soaked crusts and water. You finish your nettle soup. It wasn't filling, but it was something. And that's what the hungry gap is about. Not eating well, just eating at all. The days stretch long. You work slower. Conversations quiet. The village is hushed by hunger. No one talks of feast days or weddings. Just planting. Waiting. Hoping. A few lucky souls have smoked fish left. A wedge of dried apple tucked away in linen. You dream of biting into something crisp. A fresh pear. A green bean. A fried egg. Instead, you get another bowl of gray stew. And still, you keep going. You plant your seeds. You turn the earth. You whisper promises into the soil, because you know it won't last forever. One day the sprouts will come. The hens will lay. The hunger will fade. But for now, you eat your nettles and pray for rain. You're walking back from the fields one dusk, stomach modestly full of turnip gruel, when old Marek pulls you aside with a worried look. He clutches a bundle of herbs and whispers, almost conspiratorially, that his daughter shouldn't have eaten eggs today. It's a full moon, and everyone knows eggs bring bad luck on full moons. You blink. Welcome to the strange, twitchy world of medieval food superstitions. In an age without refrigeration, germ theory, or standardized nutrition, people filled the gaps in knowledge with belief. Food wasn't just fuel. It was sacred, symbolic, or suspicious. And if your cabbage soured too fast or your cheese turned blue overnight, something unnatural might be to blame. Take onions, for instance, a staple in every peasant's pot, but also a powerful talisman, hung in doorways to ward off evil spirits, rubbed on sick animals to drive out disease. Some believed they absorbed illness. Leave a sliced onion under your bed, and it might turn black by morning, taking your fever with it, or your soul, depending on who you asked. Historians still argue which of these beliefs were widely held versus local oddities passed down in whispered gossip. But food taboos were deeply woven into medieval life, especially in rural communities. Some were tied to religious fasting, others to the zodiac, a few to sheer culinary paranoia. Quirky aside, in parts of France, people believed that eating hare meat could make a pregnant woman's child grow a cleft lip, because hares had split mouths. Others claimed that eating too many broad beans would turn your blood black and make your thoughts impure. You once saw a neighbor bury a loaf of bread in the garden. Why? The crust had cracked in the shape of a cross, and she was convinced it meant the devil had touched it. Then there's egg lore. Eggs were rich, filling, and dangerously symbolic. They represented life, yes, but also unpredictable life. Crack one on the wrong day, and you might summon misfortune. Forget to bless your hens, and they might start laying eggs with double yolks, an omen of twins or death or both. One folk belief claimed that boiling eggs on Good Friday would trap demons inside the shell. Another warned that scrambling them without salt invited wandering spirits into your home. You stir your next batch of eggs very carefully. Milk, too, had its baggage. Fresh milk was prized, but suspicious. If it curdled too fast, you were hexed. If a woman couldn't produce breast milk, she might be accused of drinking too much goat's milk. And if you left milk out overnight and it turned, someone nearby was likely a witch. People tied food to behavior, too. Eating too many sweet things might make you vain. Bitter herbs were prescribed to the wrathful. Bread crusts were for children who lied, unless the crusts were round, in which case they'd bring wisdom. And then there were dream superstitions. Dream of eating apples? Troubles coming. Dream of roasting meat? Unexpected guests. Dream of not being fed at a feast? Best update your will. It wasn't all fearful. Some food beliefs offered comfort. A clove of garlic under the pillow to ward off nightmares. A bowl of lentils on New Year's Day for prosperity. Bread baked with love-shaped hearts into the crumb. Some said you could see who you'd marry in its patterns. But most of the time, food wasn't just survival, it was a guessing game. You never knew whether what you ate would nourish you, curse you, or make your neighbor accuse you of consorting with demons. Tonight, you dip your bread into a bowl of boiled wild herbs and try not to think about the strange shadow you saw in the cheese this morning. You lit a candle just in case. The dog barked once, then went quiet. You glance out the window. Marek's daughter is feeding her hens by moonlight. You can't hear what she's whispering to them. You decide you don't want to know. You eat, slowly, cautiously, respectfully, because in the Middle Ages, food wasn't just sacred. It was watching. You sit beside the hearth, your bowl empty, your belly just full enough to quiet the day's hunger. Smoke drifts up from the fire. The room is dim. Outside, the wind brushes against the shutters like an old friend checking in. And in the flicker of the flames, you start to think about everything you've eaten and everything you haven't. The food of medieval times wasn't crafted for joy. It was built for endurance. It was how you kept moving, how you made it through rain and taxes and grief. Every bite of salted pork, every spoonful of pottage, every slab of crusty, questionable bread. It told the story of how you survived a world that rarely gave anything freely. But even in its roughness, medieval food mattered. Carried the rhythms of the year. Lent, harvest, famine, feast. It reflected your place, your class, your region, your church calendar. What you ate revealed who you were. The peasants fed the land. The land fed the manor. The manor hosted the feasts, and the feast waste trickled back down. You could tell the story of an entire village by the contents of one soup pot. Historians still argue whether medieval food was always as grim as the stereotypes suggest. Some records hint at regional brilliance: herb pastes in Moorish Spain, tart berry sauces in Scandinavia, cheese pies from Swiss chalets. Fragments of flavor buried under centuries of assumption. And yet, we know this much. Most people ate what they could, not what they wanted. Quirky aside, one English lord insisted on having roasted hedgehog at every solstice feast. Another noble demanded his bread be cut into exactly 7-pointed stars. Not for taste, for tradition, because even when food didn't taste magical, people tried to make it mean something. You think about the salted fish that made you gag, the soft beer that made you nap, the boiled cabbage that's still lingering in your breath. Not exactly gourmet, but still yours. Your world didn't offer much variety. No coffee, no chocolate, no tomatoes or chili peppers or potatoes. But it did offer small mercies. A good onion, a warm crust, a berry found too early in spring. And for all its blandness, medieval food shaped the future. The rituals of bread baking, the spice routes that changed empires, the shared trenchers that taught you to eat with others. You can trace the DNA of your modern meals back through these cold, cramped kitchens. There is something tender in that. A quiet thread stretching from your ancestors' humble barley gruel to your morning toast. You close your eyes now. Let the fire soften. Let the world outside blur. The food may have sucked, yes, but the people, they endured. They learned. They loved each other with loaves and ladles. They made do, and tomorrow you'll do it again. One spoonful at a time. And now the fire fades low. The coals whisper softly. The night settles in like flour dust over the fields. The smells of old bread and soup pots cling to the walls, warm and familiar, like a worn blanket. Outside, the stars blink awake above thatched rooftops, above barley fields and sheepfolds. The world slows down, and so do you. You feel the ache of the day, the weight of simple work, the dull comfort of a fullish belly. The food wasn't perfect, wasn't even particularly good, but it was enough. And in this quiet moment, fingers clean, breath steady, you understand why they kept going. You picture the next sunrise, the baker kneading dough in the dark, the washerwoman boiling greens before the birds sing, the children chasing chickens before chores. Life continues. Always. You sink deeper into your straw mat. Listen to the gentle rhythm of your own breath. You've walked the muddy streets, tasted the sour beer, shared the wooden spoon, laughed at the oddities, cringed at the textures, and maybe, just maybe, found something peaceful in the predictability of it all. Rest now. Let the stories of salted meat and boiling pots drift away. Let your dreams be filled not with pottage, but with fields of rye and the scent of wild thyme. You're safe. You're fed. You're home. Sleep well, friend.